it was clear to us that the opportunity before us is that in the past 4 years, the totality of the telecoms market has grown from 131 billion rands in 2007 to roughly 179 billion rands in 2010. And in the figures that we estimate from the department, is that this sector will grow to about 187 billion rand in the year 2011. With a possible figure, if you take the vision up to 2010, a possible figure of approximately 250 billion rand. So the size of the market in the year 2020 has a very real possibility that it will amount to a revenue pot of about 250 billion rand. Now, in order to get to this figure, we believe that we have to construct a high road into the year 2020. So the conversation about a developmental partnership is precisely how do we build the basis for a high road growth in the ICT sector. A robust sector that must actualize the potential that is in the offering, and to ensure that in the way we do this, both the companies, the companies in the sector will get a profitable return for their shareholders, because that's what they're all about. They're about creating a commercial dividend and a return for their shareholders and the investment that they make. We in government understand that. We want to support that. But in return for that kind of support, we want to make sure that there are certain developmental dividends that must accrue to the people of this country. And we're very focused on that. That developmental dividend must express itself in having greater accessibility and affordability on telecommunication services to our general population. So we want to make sure that we improve and increase the accessibility of telecom services and communication services to our people. We would be quite happy to take any questions that you may want to ask on these matters, and the panel is happy to comment and free to comment on it.
The top 30 ICT companies, if they've compiled with the initial 16 signatories for the ICT Charter, and where exactly is this charter, and what are the expectations for 2011?
Being globally competitive, just the panel sitting here and the various CEOs that are representing most of the ICT industry, I think in pretty much every one of our cases, the businesses already are global, which I think has already proved that we can compete globally, as the Minister has correctly said. I think not only can we compete globally with Altex, who've got operations in India, in Sydney, Australia, and in 6 countries in East Africa. So I think it is possible, and it obviously is important to do it in the right way and to get manufacturing costs down and to do the right things from an efficiency, productivity point of view. But it definitely has been a case that I think has been proved that we can be global. I think at the same time I would like to just on behalf of the industry maybe, and my colleagues on the panel here today can comment themselves, but it is exceptionally enlightening and refreshing to be able to see from an industry perspective the Minister taking as a leadership position such as what has been undertaken today. I think we mustn't underestimate that it is absolutely imperative for government and industry to work together. And I think in previous years and prior to the Minister's appointment, maybe that dialogue was not there.
I sat down with Minister Padayachie after the media roundtable to give us his views on the industry, and this is what he had to say. Minister, thank you very much for joining CNBC Africa and Telco Talk. Let's start off with the general theme that we're looking at here, and it's literally springing off what we saw from Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan to tackle unemployment, to create jobs, and to ensure that government works closely with the private sector. Tell us about the ICT sector in South Africa and how it plans to leverage off some of the comments made by the Minister.
Well, I think this initiative really flows from the state president's address when President Zuma called on government as a whole to enter into a creative partnership with the private sector. Now, you will know that from the speech of the president, he gave a brilliant account of the progress government has made in meeting the 5 priority areas that government has committed itself to in the manifesto. And he clearly identified the priority for 2011, which is job creation, and have called upon, in fact, the entire nation to do what is necessary to ensure that we build jobs, more jobs, and some more jobs in the sector. So we thought it was necessary that we should expand on this. Mr. Gordon, the finance minister, was able to also demonstrate that the organization of the budget for the coming year fully supports and is in line with the policy priorities and the program priorities that the president announced. And you know that Mr. Gordon has announced, I think, a figure of about 150 billion rands for the creation of jobs over the next 3 years. And also there is the establishment of the Job Creation Fund of 9 billion rands, which is under the leadership of Minister Patel. And there's also a further 20 billion rands, which the IDC has committed for job creation. So there's a clear determination by the state that we must be serious about job creation. Now, this conversation is a conversation with the Minister of Communications and the leading captains of the ICT industry to invite them into a developmental partnership with the minister and the department, and to look at what the basis of that partnership could be and what the agenda for that partnership should be and how we should structure it. But the critically important focus going forward in the programs that we want to implement is to define what it is that the sector can do to create more jobs.
And you're working with 30 of the biggest companies here in South Africa, and you've created dialogue between industry players, something perhaps that hasn't really happened in the past. And we use, some of the critics' comments that have been made about the industry and the Department of Communications, that it was in a very difficult position before you were appointed as Communications Minister. Tell us about your thoughts and the agenda going forward for industry players to communicate with one another and work closely to address some of the issues, not only in the ICT sector, but challenges that South Africa face as a whole.
Well, we were very, very encouraged, and positively so, when a number of the commentators expressed the need for us to build a much more stronger and deeper dialogue. Personally, all of them were very congratulatory on the initiative we took in calling this thing together. And the conversation was very nicely done because we had a panel of about 8 people engaging in a discussion in response to the minister's speech.
And you acted very quickly, a
And
couple of days after the budget as well.
Yes, and then immediately after that, the rest of the people who were in attendance had their own discussions around the table. Now, when they reported back, and there were 9 groups that reported, every one of them endorsed the need for this dialogue to continue, and in fact requested that a specialized working group, steering group, be set up to take the programs going forward. Now, what are the challenges? Clearly, we asked people to focus on what could be a 2020 vision for the ICT sector. And we gave them some figures in our speech, and we showed them what is the opportunity before us. And I want to just look at that and quote to you. And we're saying that over the past 4 years, the total telecom market has grown from about 131 billion rands in 2007 to roughly 179 billion rands in 2010. That's the size of the revenue pot in telecoms. And we estimate that by the year 2020, we're talking about a pot of 250 billion rands. Now, in order for us to ensure that that is achieved, we need to build a program, a high road program for the ICT sector going up to 2020. So we were inviting the sector to come into constructing the agenda for that high road, so that we can say by the time we arrive in 2020, the size of the market and the revenue streams that will grow out of this will be roughly between 250 or more billion rands.
And that's a phenomenal amount that you're looking at. So you're talking about mobilizing the private sector. What is the next point of call? And I'd also like to allude to some of the comments that you've made, that the telecom sector is bigger than just the South African market. It stems across the whole continent. And you've also said that it's not just isolated to UK and US companies coming into the market and dominating the industry globally and well in South Africa and on the continent, but it's also about South African companies taking some of those opportunities. So are you looking at Pan-African growth as opposed to just South African growth?
No, this is a very important point, because I think that in the stable of companies we have in South Africa, there are some very, very competent, globally competitive companies that have already started to march in building a brand which is beyond the South African borders. And I was trying to say that we've got to think bigger and wider than the South African market, because there is the whole of the African market. And if you just take, for example, the DTT project on digital migration and the manufacturing of set-top boxes. Now, the DVB-T2 standards has now been adopted by 22 African countries. This is just SADC alone. 22 African countries, and they're all waiting for South Africa to produce the set-top boxes. And
Are we in
saying,
a position to produce these set-top boxes? Do we have the capacity? Do we have the skills?
we certainly have the companies there who are able to do it. And what these companies are also saying to us, that they want to grow the industry in a way in which they can encourage even the other smaller players to come into the manufacturing scenario. So there is a very real possibility that through the DTT project, we may be able to rebuild a manufacturing base in ICT, and particularly in the electronics industry, and we want our companies to take that. The market potential that we're talking about is not just Africa. We're saying there's an enormous opportunity in India, because we have a partnership with India on a principled basis. There's an even bigger opportunity in China, because the China-South Africa agreement does specify certain privileges for both of the companies. There's the whole of Latin America, which finds us politically acceptable, and now we're into BRICS. So we've got all of these market potentials, and there's no reason why South African ICT companies can really reach out into those markets and become truly global. And the idea is to build global brands. So build global brands even in ICT services. They are waiting for South African companies. So why should we allow the continent to be the playing field of just the American and British companies?
Well, when you look at mobile communications in South Africa, penetration has increased from 78% a couple of years ago to around 104% at this point in time. So we've exceeded the 100% level. We have been viewed as a last frontier on a telecoms basis in Africa. What do you make of other players such as, for instance, Bharti Airtel coming into the African continent, creating these price wars that we keep alluding to? We know that MTN is a very strong player. Perhaps Vodacom would like to leverage more on the African growth story, but some players perhaps a little late to get into the market. Do you think that there is still scope for South African companies, especially from a mobile perspective, to enter and penetrate Africa?
No, there's an enormous potential. And I think one of the things that our companies have got to realize is that you're always going to be facing the competition. And that's the thing. The discussion then must be, how can we become more competitive?
And how can we become more competitive? What is the point of
And that's the answer that they've got to find. I can't give them the answer. So if it's a question of regulatory support, then we'll look at regulatory support. But they must accept that the environment is going to be contested. But what they have is a positive that the others don't have, is that the rest of the African countries and the African governments, they want a strategic alliance with South Africa.